China remembers everything the West would rather forget, and that memory has now become a form of power. There is a simple idea that trust takes years to build, but only seconds to destroy. And when that destruction happens at the scale of an entire nation, the consequences last for centuries. To understand China's behavior today, you have to understand how it remembers the past. Imagine being one of the world's richest and most advanced civilizations for centuries, believing you are the center of the world, and then suddenly being humiliated, divided, drugged, and controlled by foreign powers who insist they are bringing you progress and civilization. This experience defines modern China. In the early 1800s, China was economically dominant, exporting tea, silk, porcelain, and luxury goods that Europe desperately wanted. Britain, however, faced a serious problem. China did not want British goods and demanded silver for trade. Britain's silver reserves were draining rapidly, so instead of adjusting trade practices, the British Empire turned to opium. Massive quantities of opium were smuggled into China, not casually, but on an industrial scale, creating widespread addiction and social collapse. When the Chinese government attempted to stop this destruction and appointed Lin Zexu to enforce a ban, he confiscated and destroyed over 1,000 tons of opium. Britain's response was not negotiation but war. In 1839, Britain launched the First Opium War, essentially fighting China because it refused to allow drug trafficking. China lost badly, and this defeat shattered the long-held belief that the empire was untouchable. Once China was shown to be weak, other Western powers quickly followed. From 1842 to 1933, China was forced to sign dozens of so-called unequal treaties. These were not mutual agreements but documents signed under military threat. Each treaty stripped China of more sovereignty, opened more ports to foreign control, handed over territory, and granted legal privileges to foreigners on Chinese soil. The Second Opium War made things even worse. British and French forces invaded Beijing and deliberately looted and burned the Old Summer Palace, a cultural masterpiece built over generations, filled with irreplaceable art and historical records. There was no military necessity for this destruction. It was done purely to demonstrate power and humiliation. By the late 19th century, China had been carved into spheres of influence, with different foreign powers controlling different regions. Resources were extracted, economic decisions were dictated by outsiders, and Chinese citizens were treated as second-class people in their own country. This humiliation triggered resistance movements, most famously the Boxer Rebellion of 1900, when ordinary Chinese people rose up against foreign domination. The response was devastating. An 8-nation alliance consisting of Britain, France, Germany, Russia, Japan, the United States, Italy, and Austria-Hungary united specifically to crush Chinese resistance. After defeating the rebellion, these powers forced China to pay enormous reparations in silver, effectively punishing the country for attempting to resist exploitation. This entire period from 1839 to 1949 is known in China as the Century of Humiliation. This is not distant or forgotten history for Chinese society. It is deeply embedded in education, museums, national narratives, films, and public memory. There is even a permanent exhibition in the National Museum of China dedicated to documenting this era. When Chinese leaders speak of national rejuvenation or the Chinese dream, they are not talking about abstract nationalism. They are talking about never allowing China to be weak enough to be humiliated again. The legitimacy of the Communist Party is closely tied to this promise. When Mao Zedong stood in Tiananmen Square in 1949 and declared that the Chinese people had stood up, it was not just political rhetoric, but a symbolic end to a century of forced submission. However, even after China regained sovereignty, it was not accepted as an equal by the global system. During the Cold War, the United States and its allies worked to isolate China through trade embargoes and diplomatic exclusion. China was denied a seat at the United Nations for more than 2 decades, while Taiwan held that position. Military alliances were formed around China's borders, reinforcing the perception of encirclement. The Korean War further deepened mistrust, as Chinese and American soldiers fought directly, with heavy Chinese casualties and U.S. forces operating close to China's border. Later, the Vietnam War was also seen by China as another example of Western military power being projected into its immediate neighborhood. Even when China began opening up its economy in the 1970s, the relationship with the West remained cautious and transactional rather than trusting. When China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001, it believed it was finally being integrated into the global system on equal terms. From China's perspective, it followed the rules, opened markets, and became the world's manufacturing hub. Western companies benefited enormously from cheap labor and access to Chinese markets. But when China began developing its own advanced technology companies and moving up the value chain, the tone changed. Firms like Huawei, ZTE, and TikTok were suddenly framed as national security threats, leading to bans, sanctions, and pressure on allies to cut ties. Whether these concerns are justified or not is less important than how China interprets them. From China's view, competition was acceptable only when China stayed at the bottom of the global hierarchy. The same logic appears in geopolitics. China's actions in the South China Sea are criticized as aggressive, yet from China's perspective, the United States maintains military bases in Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, and Guam, while American aircraft carriers patrol waters thousands of miles from the U.S. mainland. A frequently overlooked event that deeply shaped Chinese perceptions occurred in 1999 during NATO's bombing of Yugoslavia, when U.S. bombs struck the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, killing 3 Chinese journalists and injuring many others. The official explanation was that outdated maps were used, but for China, the lesson was profound. International law and sovereignty are respected only when it suits Western interests. Protests erupted across China, and public anger was intense. Today, China is no longer weak. It is the world's second-largest economy, approaching the first, with advanced technology, a powerful military, and growing global influence. Yet, it operates with a long memory. When Western leaders speak about a rules-based international order, China hears an order created during a time of Chinese weakness. When they speak about free trade, China hears rules that change once competition becomes uncomfortable. When they speak about human rights, China hears a tool applied selectively. This does not mean China is always right, nor does it mean Western criticisms are always wrong. What matters is understanding the lens through which China views the world. China's foreign policy, its mistrust of Western institutions, and its push to create parallel systems all make sense when viewed through 180 years of historical trauma. China is not going to forget this past, nor is it likely to abandon a system that it believes protects it from future humiliation. This does not mean conflict is inevitable, but it does mean we are entering an era where global power will be contested and cooperation will exist alongside deep suspicion. The century of humiliation officially ended in 1949, but its shadow still stretches across the 21st century. China remembers, and that memory is no longer just history, it is policy. If you want to better understand today's global power struggles, looking at history like this is essential, and if you found this explanation useful, exploring similar deep dive perspectives will help you see the world more clearly. I'm curious to know what you think. Do you believe trust between China and the West can ever truly be rebuilt, or is history too heavy to overcome? Let me know your thoughts in the comments.